Good evening and welcome. I'm Peter Smallwood, a longtime member of the Richmond World Affairs Council and member of the advisory board. It's my pleasure to welcome all our guests, students, faculty, and members of the Richmond World Affairs Council to tonight's event, which is our final event for the summer program. The event is the future of U.S. nuclear negotiations with Iran. Before I introduce our speaker, I should review a few housekeeping details. As always, our program will start with the presentation. In order to preserve audio quality, all participants, except the speaker, will be muted at this time. Following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Please notice at the bottom of your screen a Q&A box in the bottom bar. You can click on that and type your questions in there. I will monitor the questions as they come in. I will hold questions till the end of the presentation for the Q&A session, unless the question strikes me as very short and of a clarification nature. When we get to the Q&A session, I'll read the questions for our speaker, and we'll do as many as we can in the time we have available. If we've gone through all the questions and there's still time at the end, we'll try to allow people who wish to pose their own question using the raise your hand function. We'd also like to thank Data Concepts, one of Richmond's premier IT consulting firms, for their generous support, which makes this webinar possible. Now to introduce today's speaker, Kelsey Davenport of the Arms Control Association. Ms. Davenport is the Director of Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where she focuses on nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and on international efforts to prevent proliferation and nuclear terrorism. She also reports on developments in these areas in the association's journal, Arms Control Today. She also runs the association's project to assess the effectiveness of multilateral voluntary nonproliferation initiatives, countries that are working together seeking to prevent the spread of the world's most dangerous weapons. Kelsey is the lead author of the P4+1 and Iran Nuclear Deals Alert newsletter, which assesses developments related to the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran, and on North Korea's denuclearization digest. Kelsey is the author of a series of 7 reports on efforts, 7 reports assessing the impact of the nuclear security summits on efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism. Kelsey joined the Arms Control Association in August of 2011 as a Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellow. Prior to joining the Arms Control Association, Kelsey worked at a think tank in Jerusalem researching Middle East security issues. She holds a master's degree in peace studies from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and a Bachelor of Arts, summa cum laude, in International Studies and Political Science from Butler University. I've enjoyed several of Kelsey's presentations over the years and found her reports in the journal Arms Control Today to be very insightful and very thought-provoking. So it's a great honor and pleasure for me to turn the floor over to Kelsey Davenport.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for the kind introduction, and for the Richmond World Affairs Council for hosting this event and inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and to all of you for tuning in for the event. So as Peter said, I work for an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Arms Control Association. And for your background, ACA is an independent and nonpartisan organization that was founded in 1971 to advance effective policy on arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament issues. So in that vein, we closely followed the negotiations on the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran and felt that from a nonproliferation perspective, it was a strong deal, and we supported the implementation of that deal. We also are currently supporting efforts to restore the deal. And I wanted to preface my remarks by saying this, just so you know where I stand and where our organization stands on this issue. So for today's talk, I've decided to divide my remarks into three main categories. I'm first going to talk about Iran's nuclear history, then talk about the 2015 nuclear agreement itself and what it accomplished, and end by looking at sort of where we are today and the prospects for negotiations with Iran to restore the 2015 nuclear deal and what might be next as we look forward to September when those negotiations are likely to resume. So first, I'm going to start with Iran's nuclear history. And I think that this is important because giving context to why Iran decided to pursue nuclear weapons in the past can help us understand why they ultimately gave up that weapons program, why Tehran decided to negotiate the nuclear deal with Iran, and what might cause Iran to change course down the road, if anything would influence its cost-benefit analysis and push Iran back to the point where it decides to pursue nuclear weapons again. So understanding that history, I think, can be illustrative in demonstrating Iran's thinking about nuclear weapons. So Iran's interest in pursuing a nuclear program really dates back to the Shah. And in the late 1950s, he unveiled an ambitious plan for nuclear power in the country. And he sought international support in order to build reactors across the country to fuel that plan. And now Iran's first nuclear reactor is a research reactor. Those type of reactors produce things like medical isotopes used in radiation treatments. And that reactor was actually supplied by the United States in the late 1950s. And the US continued to assist Iran into the 1960s, but in a very limited way. Iran actually sought more than just the reactors to generate nuclear power. It was looking at developing what we call a full nuclear fuel cycle, meaning Iran wanted to be able to enrich uranium to fuel the reactors and reprocess spent fuel, which can also be used for reactors. But the United States decided not to assist Iran in the acquisition and development of this technology, even though Iran had signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970. And as a member of that treaty, Iran committed not to pursue nuclear weapons and committed to allow inspections at its nuclear sites to ensure that that program was entirely peaceful. Now, the US rationale for not providing Iran with the means to produce its own fuel through uranium enrichment or plutonium reprocessing, it's really motivated by two factors. First, geopolitics in the region. There are already regional tensions that cause the United States some concern and some pause about the introducing fuel production into that region. And second, just generally, the US wanted to limit the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology out of general concern over proliferation issues. So it wasn't just Iran that the United States was not interested in giving this technology to. This was a broader policy. Now, Iran's interest in nuclear power and developing this program really changed after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, because the first supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was less interested in nuclear power. He didn't see the benefits of developing it from a civil infrastructure perspective, didn't see the benefits of deriving the fuel cycle, and certainly didn't seem interested in nuclear weapons. But his thinking on this changed, largely as a result of Iran's experience during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. And I think that this is important to mention because Iran's experience in the Iran-Iraq War is really responsible for some of the motivating factors that influenced Iranian thinking on the development of nuclear weapons. Some of the particular factors in the war that influenced thinking relate to Iran's experience being attacked by Iraqi chemical weapons. There are several clear instances where Iraq used these weapons against Iran in violation of international law, and with the knowledge of countries like the United States, and yet there was very little to no condemnation of these actions. Iran also suffered ballistic missile attacks from Iraq, and the ballistic missile experience demonstrated to Iran the military value of being able to hold cities hostage, cities at range hostage in the event of a further military conflict. So this really began to alter the supreme leader's thinking about nuclear weapons. And he then accelerated Iranian efforts to actually develop a covert nuclear weapons program, sort of alongside Iran's civil program. So Iran continued to advance its civil program. That was, of course, subject to IAEA inspections, but on the side began to develop this organized nuclear weapons effort. And I would say it was organized roughly into three different categories. First, Iran sought to actually be able to produce fissile material, the nuclear material, enriched uranium or separated plutonium that's used to fuel the nuclear weapon. This was the technology that the Shah sought from the United States, but the United States was unwilling to provide. And Iran was able to get uranium enrichment technology from a Pakistani scientist known as A.Q. Khan, who actually provided the blueprints for uranium enrichment to a number of states, including North Korea. So with this centrifuge design, centrifuges are the machines that enrich uranium, Iran began experimenting with uranium enrichment. The second main area of the organized nuclear weapons program was the actual weaponization component itself. Iran began to experiment with the explosive package that is actually necessary to detonate a nuclear device. And there's clear evidence of Iran looking into the different types of detonators and experimenting with those. And then the third category is that Iran sought to deliver its nuclear weapon. So as it developed its ballistic missile program, having seen the value of ballistic missiles in the Iran-Iraq War, it looked at how to integrate a nuclear warhead into those ballistic missiles so that if its territorial integrity was threatened, it would actually be able to respond by threatening to use a nuclear weapon. Now, based on what we know about Iran's nuclear program now, it appears that Iran intended to follow a similar route as what South Africa did in nuclear weapons development. That is, they intended to produce a small number of nuclear weapons, perhaps a half dozen devices, not disclose that they had produced weapons, but reveal them if necessary in the event of Iran's national sovereignty or territory being threatened. So it really intended for this to be a sort of a deterrent of last resort. And as I said, all of this work was done secretly because Iran was legally bound under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty not to pursue nuclear weapons. But despite their efforts to hide this program, international inspectors under the International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the agency that's charged with actually overseeing peaceful nuclear programs to ensure that there isn't any diversion to weaponization activities, began to suspect that Iran was engaged in some illicit weapons work. And this was about the 2001-2002 period. And they began to become more and more insistent that Iran allowed them access to certain sites so that they could determine if illicit work was going on there, and to ask Iran questions that clearly indicated that they had some knowledge of Iran's illicit activities. So also around this time in 2003, of course, is when the United States invaded Iraq, using the justification that Iraq had a weapons of mass destruction program. And as we now know, it was in 2003 that Iran decided to end its organized nuclear weapons efforts. Again, this was partially motivated seeing the experience of Iraq and being concerned that the same could happen to Iran, and partially because their program really was no longer the secret that they hoped it was. International inspectors were becoming increasingly insistent in trying to determine if Iran was engaged in these illicit activities. Now, when I say the program ended, that's when the US intelligence community and the International Atomic Energy Agency assessed that the program had ended. And the US intelligence community ultimately decided that Iran's nuclear decision-making on weapons development was being guided by a cost-benefit analysis. So essentially by 2003, looking at the Iraq experience, looking at the likely fallout from this illicit nuclear weapons program, Iran decided that the cost of pursuing nuclear weapons outweighed the security benefits. And the intelligence community continues to think that that cost-benefit analysis guides Iran's nuclear thinking. So as I said, this is when the intelligence community assessed the program has ended. Iran has actually never admitted that it pursued nuclear weapons. And it reiterates that there's a fatwa in Iran, or a religious teaching against nuclear weapons, that was put in place by the current supreme leader. So they essentially argue that Iran's nuclear program is and has always been entirely peaceful, and it will remain so in part because of this fatwa. Now, despite the program ending, the International Atomic Energy Agency continued to push Iran to answer questions about these past illicit activities. And Iran, of course, refused to comply, refused to cooperate. And as a result, they were referred to the Security Council. And it really was this referral to the Security Council that kicked off a series of US and UN sanctions that were designed to pressure Iran to negotiate over its nuclear program. Because even though the program had officially ended, and the intelligence community felt quite confident that it had ended, they assessed that Iran essentially had a nuclear weapons capability, meaning that Iran had mastered the necessary technologies and processes to produce a nuclear weapon if the decision were ever made to do so. So there's a significant imperative to try to restrict Iran's nuclear program and monitor it to ensure that the international community would have time to respond if Iran ever decided to pursue nuclear weapons. So this combination of international pressure from the sanctions regime that built up between 2006 and 2013, and then the inauguration of Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who took over from President Ahmadinejad, who was not interested in negotiations, spurred the West, really created the opportune moment to engage in negotiations with the multilateral group known as the P5+1. And that includes the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Great Britain, sorry, I already said Great Britain, France, Russia, and China, sort of under the coordination of the EU. And like I said, it really was that combination of the sanctions pressure, Rouhani feeling like he had a mandate to negotiate, Iran wanting to repair the reputational damage from Ahmadinejad, and also seeing a willing partner in the Obama administration that led to the negotiations that ultimately produced the nuclear deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Jcpoa. And I'm happy to talk more in the question and answer about the sanctions and those impacts and some of the efforts that led up to those negotiations, if there are detailed questions on those. But the second main part that I want to talk about now is actually the nuclear deal itself, what it accomplished, how it was implemented, and where it stands today. So as I said, a combination of factors led to the successful negotiations of the nuclear deal. The sanctions certainly had an impact, the personalities had an impact, Iran's changed security calculus had an impact, and all of that, like I said, led to an agreement, in 2015 that was ultimately endorsed by the UN Security Council. Now, the nuclear deal with Iran is what we would characterize as a transactional arrangement. Essentially, it traded nuclear sanctions relief at both the UN, US, and EU level for nuclear concessions from Iran. And I bring this up because a lot of people expected transformational results from the nuclear deal. Essentially, they thought that reaching the deal would lead to changes to Iran's activities in the region that are perceived as threatening to US security interests, that it might lead Iran to be more restrained on its ballistic missile programs, that it might lead to more of an opening up in Iran. And they criticized the Jcpoa for failing to achieve these results. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the nuclear deal was never intended to do that. Like I said, it was a very transactional deal, trading sanctions relief for nuclear concessions. Now, I think there was a hope at the time that the nuclear deal could serve as a platform for future talks. And initially it did. There were some engagements between Iran and several of the European countries about things like ballistic missiles and the security. But ultimately that prospect sort of died out when President Trump was elected and when he took a more hardline approach to Iran and the nuclear deal. So anyways, getting back to the deal itself though, what the nuclear deal essentially did was put in place a set of extensive limitations on Iran's nuclear activities and set up a very intrusive international monitoring system. And I would divide Iran's commitments generally into three main categories under the deal. First, it put in place stringent limits on Iran's nuclear fuel production. So essentially, it limited Iran's uranium enrichment. Now, when negotiations on the Jcpoa began, if Iran had decided to produce enough nuclear material for a bomb, it could have done so in about 2 to 3 months. That was the extent to which it had built up its uranium enrichment capacity and its stockpile of enriched uranium. What the deal did was dramatically increase that time, that 2 to 3 months, to 12 months by limiting the number of centrifuges Iran could operate, by limiting the enriched uranium it could keep in the country, and limiting the enrichment levels. So as a result, for the first 10 years of the nuclear deal, the United States and its partners would essentially have 1 year to respond to any attempt by Iran to break out of the deal and pursue nuclear weapons. And this was judged as sufficient time to try to prevent Iran from taking those steps or deter Iran from taking those steps. So the second main component of the nuclear deal is the intrusive monitoring that it put in place. Now, there are a number of steps that constitute this monitoring regime that were really designed to ensure that every element of Iran's nuclear program was intrusively monitored. So one measure that was put in place, for instance, that Iran is obligated to implement in perpetuity is expanded access for inspectors. So with the nuclear deal in place, inspectors have access to a greater number of locations in Iran, and they can access those locations on short notice. And that helps them, conduct these so-called snap inspections, again, to ensure that the program is entirely peaceful. In addition to that, the Jcpoa put in place continuous surveillance at key nuclear sites. So essentially, certain nuclear activities were monitored in real time. And it also expanded the IAEA's access to undeclared sites. And what I mean by that is that prior to the Jcpoa, if inspectors wanted to visit a location in Iran that was outside of the declared nuclear program, perhaps because they would have suspicions about illicit activity, Iran could deny and stonewall those requests, as they did in that, 2003 period, and really prevent inspectors from accessing those sites for a significant period of time. The Jcpoa essentially closes that loophole. It ensures that if inspectors request access to a site, they're granted that access within 24 days. That essentially ensures that Iran cannot sanitize a site before inspectors could get there to test for things like the presence of uranium that indicates an illicit activity. So again, a very strong monitoring regime, really the strongest nuclear monitoring regime ever negotiated. And then finally, the third component of the deal are weaponization restrictions. And these two, last in perpetuity. Now, this is important because in the past, when the IAEA was investigating Iran's pre-2003 nuclear weapons program, Iran claimed that some of the weaponization activities were for civil uses, oil drilling, for instance, or for conventional military purposes, denying that they were ever intended to build a nuclear weapon. Now, if the IAEA detects these activities and has evidence of these activities, Iran can no longer claim that they were for another purpose, essentially because these activities have become completely illegal under the Jcpoa. Iran gave up its right to use them even for civil purposes or for conventional military purposes. And again, this is one of the restrictions that lasts in perpetuity. So if we look at this combination, the limits on fuel production, the intrusive monitoring, the weaponization restrictions, really, I think this deal provides a very strong assurance that if Iran decided to pursue nuclear weapons, they would be quickly detected. And if Iran tried to pursue an illicit program, the IAEA would have the tools necessary to quickly investigate and stymie any illicit activities. Now, when the Jcpoa was finalized in July of 2015, it actually could have been blocked by the United States Congress under a law that allowed congressional review of the deal. It ultimately wasn't, but I bring this up because I think it's important to discuss a few of the criticisms of the nuclear deal. So one of the main criticisms that we heard then and we continue to hear to this day is that some of the limits in the Jcpoa expire. And that is certainly true. As I mentioned, that 1-year breakout time established by the Jcpoa starts to decline after 10 years, and by 15 years, the breakout time could really be quite small as a result of the Jcpoa. And I think concern about what happens to Iran's nuclear program at that point is certainly valid. But I think it's important to keep this context in mind. First, that some of the restrictions are permanent, that would still serve as a bulwark to nuclear weapons. And the idea was to build on the Jcpoa to ensure that after some of these limits expire, that Iran would not be incentivized to pursue nuclear weapons and perhaps new limits would be negotiated. And that's fairly typical in the nuclear space. Few nuclear deals are ever permanent. Russian arms control, for instance. Generally, those treaties expire and then they're built upon or extended. So the sunsets is one of the criticisms of the Jcpoa. Second criticism is that it didn't address the country's ballistic missiles. Again, I think that this is a fair criticism. I would have liked to see a deal address Iran's ballistic missiles, but I think addressing ballistic missiles now is more appropriate in a regional security context. Because when Iran abandoned its nuclear weapons program, it continued to build up its ballistic missile capabilities, but focused those much more on the region. So Iran's ballistic missile capabilities are really a response to the conventional military superiority of countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. And this is because Iran has been subject to a conventional arms embargo, up until last year as part of those UN sanctions efforts to push Iran to negotiate on its nuclear weapons program. So the ballistic missiles really now are about Iran's regional security. So despite these criticisms, as I said, the JCPOA was adopted, and it was successfully implemented for just over 2 years, from January of 2016 to May of 2018. Now, the US intelligence community regularly assessed during that time that Iran was abiding by its commitments, as did the International Atomic Energy Agency. It reported, quarterly to the IAEA as a whole on Iran's implementation of the deal. And as I said, both demonstrated that Iran was abiding by its commitments. The US intelligence community also regularly assessed the impact of the nuclear deal and indicated that it provided the United States with more insight into Iran's nuclear activities and that it extended that breakout time. And essentially, they have continued to conclude, even now that when Iran is in violation of the JCPOA, that Iran has not resumed key weaponization activities as part of its nuclear program. So unfortunately, despite the clearly documented benefits of the JCPOA and Iran's clear record of compliance, President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA in May of 2018 and reimposed US sanctions on Iran in violation of the deal. Now, he argued at the time that this was necessary because the deal hadn't changed Iran's activities in the region, and because he felt like Iran was receiving more sanctions relief benefit from the deal than the United States was receiving on the nonproliferation side. He also seemed to believe that the United States could pressure Iran into a better deal, a deal with longer limits, a deal that also addressed issues like ballistic missiles and human rights by ratcheting up sanctions on Iran. Unfortunately, though, Trump had little to no international support for this approach. And if we look back to why the negotiations in the lead up to the JCPOA were successful, it was in part because there was strong international support and implementation of both UN and US sanctions. And the Trump administration, did not have that in 2018 when it reimposed sanctions, in part because the deal had been endorsed by the UN Security Council and because it was generally acknowledged that Iran was meeting its commitments, under the deal. So Iran tried to stay in compliance with the deal after the Trump administration withdrew. And it worked particularly with the European parties to the JCPOA to try to receive some of the sanctions benefits envisioned by the deal. But ultimately, after a year in May of 2019, Iran reached the conclusion that the transactional arrangement, had become one-sided, that Iran essentially was still restricting its nuclear program, but not receiving any sanctions relief benefits. And that's because of the breadth of US sanctions. Essentially, the United States had threatened to target foreign companies doing business with Iran, and were able to do that under sanctions law. So all of the European countries that had gone back into business with Iran after the deal was finalized pulled out of fear of US sanctions and being cut off from the US financial market. So like I said, in May of 2019, Iran had essentially made the cost-benefit analysis that it wasn't receiving from the deal what it intended to, and decided that if it ratcheted up its nuclear activities in violation of the deal, it might be able to pressure the Europeans, Russia and China, the remaining parties to the deal, to try to deliver more seriously on sanctions relief, and perhaps even try to pressure the United States, back into the deal. So this, I think, was an unfortunate decision by Iran, but again, it's not surprising because Tehran didn't feel like it was benefiting from the JCPOA. So between 2019 and 2021, Iran began to violate the deal. And initially, these violations were very carefully calibrated. Iran, went slightly over the stockpile limit on enriched uranium. They slightly increased enrichment levels. And all of the steps were designed to be quickly reversible, if there were sanctions relief. Unfortunately, though, particularly in this past year, Iran's violations have become more serious. And some of this was negotiated, some of this was prompted by other factors. Last December, for instance, the Israelis assassinated a prominent nuclear scientist, Moshe Fakhrizadeh. And at that point, the parliament pushed through a new nuclear law in Iran that stipulated that President Rouhani, the then president of Iran, had to take more serious steps to violate the Jcpoa. And that's when Iran began to reduce compliance with international monitoring, and it began to engage in more serious research and development efforts on its nuclear program that are more difficult to reverse. So Iran essentially tried, through this package of violations to pressure the United States back into the deal. And that really brings us to sort of the third area I wanted to touch upon in this talk, which is sort of where we are now and what the prospects are for further talks to restore the Jcpoa, and if those prospects fail, what the United States might do from a policy perspective. So when President Biden was running for office, he made very clear his approach to Iran. He said first he supported a compliance for compliance return to the Jcpoa. So essentially the United States would lift sanctions on Iran in return to the nuclear deal if Iran reversed its violations and began fully implementing its nuclear obligations again. He also said he sought to build on the deal. He essentially wanted to pursue what he refers to as a longer and stronger deal, which would address some of those concerns I raised about the future of Iran's nuclear program after limits expire, and to also pursue a parallel set of talks addressing regional security in the region, which could perhaps encompass Iran's ballistic missile program. And from a nonproliferation perspective, Biden's approach is currently feasible. The nonproliferation benefits of the nuclear deal, I think, can be fully restored. But I would just note that the window of time to do that is quite short. As I said, Iran has been engaging over this past year in a more serious set of violations, testing more advanced centrifuges, trying to produce uranium metal, which can be used to fuel reactors or for the core of a nuclear weapon. And as it ratchets up these activities, like I said, some of the knowledge that Iran gained, cannot be reversed. So before the end of the year, we may end up in a nonproliferation situation where the Biden administration approach is no longer feasible and the Jcpoa cannot be restored because the United States would be giving more to Iran than it would essentially be receiving in terms of non-pro benefits. But before I get to that, if we kind of rewind to when Biden was elected, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who just left office, last week, he was expressing a similar sentiment regarding the Jcpoa as Biden was. He emphasized that Iran was willing to reverse its violations if sanctions on Iran were lifted, in a verifiable way. And he emphasized the reversibility of Iran's nuclear actions and its willingness to come back into complete compliance with the Jcpoa. So beginning in March, after the Biden team was established, Iran and the United States met in Vienna for 6 rounds of talks. These talks were all conducted indirectly. So Iran was essentially in one room, the US in another, and the EU sort of shuttled back in between. And despite this more sort of inefficient method of discussions, progress was made throughout these 6 rounds. Significant progress was made on the sanctions that the United States would lift, because not only did it have to lift the sanctions specified in the Jcpoa, but also additional sanctions that the Trump administration had imposed between 2018 and Trump leaving office that would have made it difficult for Iran to actually receive the sanctions relief envisioned by the deal. So they made progress determining what sanctions would be lifted. They also made considerable progress looking at the logistics of rolling back Iran's nuclear program, what that would look like. And they began to talk about the sequence, who would kind of take what step at what time. Now, initially, it looked like the goal was to try to reach an agreement on restoring the Jcpoa before President Rouhani left office in June. And it appeared that that this would be likely, in part because the Supreme Leader had given his blessing to Rouhani to negotiate a restoration of the deal, that he said a restoration of the deal was in Iran's best interest, and the Supreme Leader is the ultimate decider on nuclear policy. And it looked like this would also benefit the new incoming president, Ibrahim Raisi. So despite the fact that Iran has an election system for its president, all of the candidates have to be vetted. And it was very clear during the vetting process that the path was being made clear for Raisi to win. Raisi is tipped by many to perhaps be the next Supreme Leader because of his conservative nature and his close ties to this current Supreme Leader. So it appeared that Rouhani was going to complete the negotiations, actually do sort of the dirty work of restoring the Jcpoa, because the nuclear deal is much less popular in Iran now. And then Raisi would take office in August, which he did last week, with the Jcpoa restored, and immediately began to see some economic relief from the US having lifted sanctions. Unfortunately, though, some of the conditions of the talks, prevented restoration of the deal, before Raisi's election in June. And after Raisi was elected, he instituted a review of the negotiation process and made very clear that talks were not going to resume until after he took office in August. So he took office just last week, and it appears likely that talks are going to resume, in September. Now, when talks resume, there are going to be sort of 4 outstanding issues that are likely still going to be in place that prevented Iran and the United States from already reaching a deal. So the first of those issues is that Iran wants a guarantee that the United States won't exit the Jcpoa again, like it did in 2018. I think that's extremely unlikely to happen. The United States needs to preserve its flexibility to leave the deal and reimpose sanctions if Iran is in violation. Also, there's no way to provide that political guarantee. I mean, Biden could pledge to do that, and a subsequent administration, could renege on that promise. So I think Iran knows that. I think what Iran is really looking for is an indication that there will be sanctions relief in a meaningful way. So perhaps guarantees that certain contracts, certain investments will be made in Iran, and that's really what they're after in making that ask. The second outstanding issue is that the United States is seeking a guarantee from Iran that Iran will engage in future talks, not just on the nuclear program, but also on the regional front. Both Raisi and the Supreme Leader have expressed some objections to that. They don't want to formally commit to that. Biden, though, however, sees that as important for selling the deal in the United States, basically demonstrating that Iran's regional activities will be addressed in follow-on talks, and that concerns about the future of Iran's nuclear program after limits on the deal expire, that those will be addressed. So that looks like it's going to be a difficult issue going into September. The third point really relates to that first issue. Iran is seeking some guarantees and some assurances that sanctions relief will be realized. They're concerned that even if the US lifts sanctions, companies will be hesitant to go back into Iran because the United States may pull out again, and essentially, these companies, will be left in limbo. So Iran is concerned about actually realizing sanctions relief. And then the fourth is that there are still some challenges in addressing some of Iran's nuclear violations. The United States really wants to ensure that it can restore that 12-month breakout period so that it has time to respond to any change of course in Iran if Iran decides to pursue nuclear weapons. And that's more difficult now because of some of the research and development that Iran has done in violation of the deal. So again, figuring out some of those last nuclear elements are going to be a challenge going forward. So as I said, it appears that talks in Vienna will resume in September, with the new Raisi team in place. And I think that there are 3 ways that this could play out. So first, Raisi has taken a harder line on the Jcpoa than Rouhani. He criticized Rouhani's approach, promised more sanctions relief to the Iranian people. This could be posturing. It could be very well that Raisi is trying to set a hard line, going into the talks, that he's performing for a domestic audience, and that when talks do resume, he'll generally accept where things left off during the last round of talks in June, and that these remaining issues, will be dealt with relatively quickly because Raisi is going to want to demonstrate soon economic recovery, and there'll be a restoration of the Jcpoa. Again, I think this scenario is still likely because, as I said, the supreme leader sets nuclear policy in Iran, and he's still endorsing this approach that restoration of the deal is in the best interest of Iran. So restoring the deal, is still possible. There's more of a question mark as to whether or not there would be more immediate follow-up talks, but restoring the deal would at least arrest the current nuclear crisis and provide more time and political space to pursue those negotiations. So that's the first option, full restoration of the deal. The second is that the second sort of option or scenario that I could see playing out when talks resume is that Raisi overplays his hand and the window for restoring the Jcpoa closes. So the United States has made quite clear that if Iran's nuclear program advances to the point at which the non-proliferation benefits cannot be restored, it will stop participating in talks to return to compliance with the deal. Now, Raisi, however, at least from his public rhetoric, appears to believe that if he continues to ratchet up his nuclear activities, he might be able to leverage more concessions from the United States. So it's not clear he's taking that US threat to withdraw from the talks seriously. And we could sort of end up in a game of chicken, where neither side sort of blinks first and time runs out because Iran overplayed its hand. Now, in that scenario, I could see both the United States and Iran trying to pursue perhaps a limited deal. This might mean that the US asks Iran to halt some of its most proliferation-sensitive activities of most concern, and in return, it receives some sanctions. Iran receives some sanctions relief. Perhaps it can sell some oil, access some frozen assets. This is very similar to what we saw in 2013. There was a limited deal that froze Iran's nuclear program in exchange for some relief, while the more comprehensive negotiations on the deal that was reached in 2015 could be finalized. So that limited deal could be a possibility to create time and space for a more comprehensive deal. And this is a deal that would probably have to go beyond the Jcpoa to take into account Iran's changing nuclear situation. And then the third scenario, and the one that I think at this point is the least likely, but it is the scenario that concerns me the most, is that the talks stall. The sides just decide they cannot reach an agreement on restoring the Jcpoa, and there really is no prospect for an interim deal. I think this scenario could also happen if there's an external event that caused the talks to collapse. Just this last week, I think there was credible reports that Iran had attacked a foreign flagged vessel, in the region, killing 2 Europeans. It's incidents like this that are not related to the Jcpoa, but I think could result in a ratcheting up of tensions and an escalation that ultimately prevents and sort of spoils the prospects for restoring the Jcpoa. So in this scenario, either the talks stall completely and there's no appetite for a limited deal, or an external event causes the talks to stall. I think that that's when we have a much higher risk of conflict going forward. The United States does not have a lot left to sanction on Iran, so its main coercive pressure element is nearly used up. Additionally, if Iran continues to ratchet up its nuclear program, and that window where Iran could pursue nuclear weapons, shortens to the point of weeks, then Israel, or perhaps even the United States, might feel compelled to take military action to stop Iran's nuclear activities, or at least, temporarily, roll them back. And again, in this scenario, I think the risk of a military strike escalating to a broader conflict, is much more likely. So again, I think those first two scenarios, restoration of the deal or a limited deal that addresses the most proliferation sensitive concerns in Iran, are the most likely. I don't think either the United States or Iran is seeking conflict or is seeking an escalated standoff. Both see the value in restoring the Jcpoa, both see the value in preventing conflict. So I think that generally, one of these two scenarios is the most likely. But there's a lot of chances for miscalculation. There's a lot of external events that could change that calculus. So as I said, I think that third scenario that drastically increases the chance of conflict is likely. But we'll have to see as we move into these talks that, like I said, should be resuming, sometime next month. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to your questions and the discussions. And thank you so much for listening and your time.
Thank you, Kelsey. First off, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Excellent. Some questions are beginning to show up. As the questions start to arrive, I'll ask people to put their questions in the Q&A and not the chat. And I'll start with a sort of a clarification question. You mentioned that in the original deal, inspectors would have the right to go to a site that wasn't on the list in Iran, but they would have to wait for up to 24 days. And I'm wondering if you can help the audience understand why 24 days isn't too long. To the layperson, it would seem you can scrub anything clean in 24 days.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 24-day period was determined as an appropriate level of time due to exercises in the United States that we frequently refer to as red teaming. So the United States trains most of the international inspectors that work for the International Atomic Energy Agency. So they're familiar with the capabilities and the technologies available to the agency. So essentially during the negotiations, inspectors during the negotiations, the United States tried to sanitize a site to essentially erase the presence of uranium from that site and see how quickly they could do it. And as a result of these red team exercises, they essentially determined that given the IAEA's capabilities, it would be nearly impossible for Iran to sanitize a site in less than 24 days. And I would add to that generally when the IAEA is concerned about a site in Iran, they capture satellite imagery around that site. So they can also see if Iran is attempting to change the site. So just to give you an example of how sensitive this technology is, in 2020, the IAEA accessed a location in Iran where they believed Iran had conducted some illicit nuclear activities pre-2003. And they knew that Iran had been sanitizing this site. And despite the 17-year interval in the sanitation efforts, the IAEA was still able to detect the presence of uranium at that site. So that gives you an idea of just how sensitive the detection technology is. But like I said, that 24-day period was really determined as a result of intensive US testing to make sure that Iran wouldn't be able to fool IAEA inspectors.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm going to start working my way through the questions in the Q&A. What are your thoughts on the assassination of multiple Iranian scientists and the introduction and use of offensive cyber weapons like Sputniks to deter Iran's alleged weaponization activities? Do you see these kinds of activities as ratcheting up in severity and scope?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm really glad it came up because this wasn't something that I really addressed in the talk. So when I mentioned that sort of period between 2003 and 2013, when the United States and the UN were ratcheting up sanctions, the United States, Israel, others, also engaged in activities designed to slow Iran's nuclear program, and specifically, the United States was more focused on the cyber aspect. And they tried to introduce, using cyber, several elements into Iran's nuclear program to disrupt their centrifuges. And they had some limited success with that. Stuxnet, Olympic Games, those were some of the offensive cyber operations that we believe the United States was a part of. The Israelis, in their attempts to roll back the program, targeted for assassination Iranian nuclear scientists, and they assassinated 4 prominent scientists, prior to negotiations on the Jcpoa. And then just last year, they assassinated Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was largely considered to be sort of the father of Iran's nuclear weapons program, and was really present in that pre-2003 weapons effort. Now, I think at times, the assassinations, the offensive cyber attacks, may slow Iran's nuclear program, but this is a very short-term gain, and I think it actually has adverse effects in the long term, because Iran has responded to all of these activities by ratcheting up its nuclear activities further. So for instance, post Stuxnet, Iran significantly ramped up its uranium enrichment levels. After Fakhrizadeh was assassinated, their violations of the Jcpoa became significantly more severe. So my concern is that these attempts to slow Iran's nuclear program actually backfire in 2 ways. They push Iran to develop more advanced nuclear capabilities, and that over time, cumulatively, they could change Iran's cost benefit about nuclear weapons. If Iran believes that the benefits of nuclear weapons, that deterring these types of attacks, outweigh the enormous sanctions and diplomatic pressure, it could respond to these attacks by just deciding to openly pursue nuclear weapons. So again, I think that the very limited short-term gains that might slow and roll back the program, just don't compare to the long-term risks that these strategies result in.
Thank you. The next question is a bit, what just happened? My screen just jolted. Try to bring the next question back. I'm not quite certain what happened with my screen. I've lost the next question, but I recall it talked about the Iranian motivation for a weapons program of vulnerabilities and fear of Iraq's weapons program and fear of Israel's nuclear weapons program. And so the questioner was asking, why doesn't the United States also work on Israel as a weapons developer and potential proliferator?
So that again is a great question. And personally, I would like to see the United States take a much more strict line on Israel's nuclear program and start by actually acknowledging that Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel engages in what it refers to as a policy of nuclear opacity, meaning they consistently say that they won't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, even though everybody knows that Iran has nuclear weapons. They just won't own up to it. And because Iran never joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it never legally gave up its right to develop nuclear weapons. Its nuclear weapons program is actually not illegal under international law. Immoral, I would say certainly. Destabilizing, I would say definitely, but not technically illegal in the way that Iran's is. I certainly would like to see the United States be more forward-leaning on, pushing Israel to engage in more of the standard non-proliferation norms, some of the standard, arms control and disarmament norms. But I think that's unlikely, unfortunately, given the history of the US-Israeli relationship. But where I think there may be space is that, if the Jcpoa is restored, rather than pursuing a deal that builds on the Jcpoa that's solely focused on Iran, I would like to see the United States and the other countries that negotiated the deal take a more regional approach. The regional nuclear landscape is very different now than it was in 2015. Saudi Arabia has threatened to pursue nuclear weapons. They're pursuing a civil nuclear program with very few international safeguards. The UAE certainly has indicated that they may change course depending on Iran's actions, and Turkey has openly threatened nuclear weapons. So I think a regional dialogue focused perhaps on regional nuclear limits, could be a way to begin those conversations about nonproliferation and arms control in the region. I don't think Israel is likely to join, from the onset, but creating that space for regional security discussions, for regional nuclear discussions, could at some point down the road, regional conditions permitting, enfold and envelop Israel. But like I said, in the near term, I don't think we're going to see the U.S. take a stronger stance on Israel's nuclear program, unfortunately.
Thank you. And my apologies to the writer of that question that for some reason, the screen advanced where I was not able to continue reading that question, but I now see the full question. I think you addressed the nature of that question well. My apologies to the writer who was more eloquent than I was on that. So for the next question, how do you assess the impact of Iran's adverse actions by proxy or otherwise in the Middle East?
So I think that Iran's support for non-state actors, its support for the Syrian regime, certainly has a destabilizing impact on the region, and I think could disrupt efforts to restore the nuclear deal. As I mentioned, there was this recent incident involving an Iranian attack on a ship. We've also seen Iranian-backed militias in Iraq exchanging, fire with U.S. troops, in the region. So I think that, that these types of events and interactions could really be a spoiler for the nuclear talks. And I think, restoring the nuclear deal really is imperative, before addressing these nuclear problems or these regional problems, and our concern about Iran's support for Hezbollah, its support for Hamas, its support for the Houthis, because every challenge that the United States faces with Iran is more difficult if Iran's nuclear program is unrestrained, and there's the concern about an Iranian nuclear weapon. So essentially assuring that the existential threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon is dealt with, I think clears the space and creates some breathing room to engage more productively, on these regional issues. But yes, I mean, I'm not a regionalist, so I don't want to get too much into how these scenarios may play out. But I certainly think that Iran's activities in the region, the proxy support, could result in a situation that destabilizes Jcpoa talks.
Excellent. So what is the status of the trading relationship with Iran, with the Jcpoa members who are still parties to that agreement? Are they trading with Iran? Is the special facility that was set up to facilitate financial transaction working?
Yeah, great question. So much of the business with Iran that originated from Europe, dried up after the US reimposed sanctions in 2018. And that's because most of these firms and banks that were facilitating this business had considerable business interests with the United States and didn't want to risk being cut off from the US financial system. Some business from Russia and China in particular continued. China, for one, has banks that essentially don't do any business with the United States. So they're a bit more impervious to the effects of US sanctions, so they can continue to take that risk. Iran is continuing to sell oil to China, for instance. That's something the US has threatened to sanction if Jcpoa talks collapse, even though it may be difficult for the US to actually do that. So there is still some trade from Russia and China and other countries. But it's not nearly the volume that Iran envisioned as coming to it after the Jcpoa was implemented. And it's not necessarily the trade that Iran wants either. I mean, this may change under Raisi, but the Rouhani government was looking to establish stronger economic ties with Europe. They didn't want to be dependent on China and Russia. So the special facility that was set up to facilitate financial transactions is a mechanism known as INSTEX. And the Europeans worked with Iran to establish that because they believed it would be a channel that would be immune from US sanctions. It would essentially allow businesses in Europe and Iran to engage in sort of a barter system in a way that wouldn't touch the US financial system, so the US wouldn't be able to target it. Unfortunately, despite efforts to set it up, it's only processed about one trial transaction. And that's largely because you can set up a mechanism, but you can't force companies to take advantage of it. And I think there was still so much concern amongst European businesses that the US might find a way to sanction them, or that there would be reputational repercussions, and they might be sort of informally blacklisted from the United States, that they didn't want to engage in that. So I think it was an interesting effort. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But it did, I think, demonstrate to Europe that it may need to think about more financial independence from the United States. Europe really wanted INSTEX to work so it could preserve the nuclear deal, because it viewed the nuclear deal as in its best interest, and it fell victim to US sanctions policy. So I think it's been a bit of an eye-opening experience towards Europe and its dependence on the United States.
This question is from looking at the inside of Iran. Are there elements within Iran, say the Revolutionary Guard, that may be attempting to crater the talks with the US, even if the rest of the government favors going forward?
Absolutely. And this has been the case since the Jcpoa was negotiated, that factions in Iran have opposed the deal, attempted to prevent Rouhani from implementing the deal, and certainly appear intent on sabotaging the talks. I think the motivations behind some of these factions differ. Some of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, have benefited from US sanctions because of some of the black market channels that they're able to set up, and have profited enormously during times of US sanctions. There are some that also just, virulently oppose any type of engagement with the West. So I think that we will continue to see those efforts. But ultimately, if the Supreme Leader endorses an agreement to restore the Jcpoa, then I think efforts to try to oppose it will ultimately not be successful. The Supreme Leader now, he essentially controls the presidency, given that, Raisi is considered very close to him. So, I think he'll be able to sort of keep the government in line there, and those oppositional factions won't be successful.
Excellent. I think that's all of the questions in the Q&A. I have one last one for you that's sort of a play off the last question. In the United States, who do you see, or what where are the best proponents to try to make recreate the JPA, the agreement, and what are the biggest obstacles within the United States political arena?
Yeah, so similar to Iran, there are factions in the United States that have consistently opposed the Jcpoa and that oppose efforts to restore it. I mean, some of those factions supported President Trump's approach, thinking that if we just ratcheted up pressure enough on Iran, Iran would ultimately capitulate. I think that was never going to happen. The United States was never going to be able to generate that sanctions pressure. But certainly, these factions are going to try to oppose Biden's approach to restoring the Jcpoa. And the main tactic that I think they'll use is to try to force a congressional review of the Jcpoa. So I mentioned in 2015, Congress had the opportunity to essentially block the agreement, but they couldn't. The opposing forces to the Jcpoa, couldn't constitute a majority to prevent the deal from going through. So Congress may try to argue that whatever agreement Biden reaches to restore the deal is a new deal and therefore subject to congressional review. I think the Biden administration will likely refute this and say this is just a return to the old deal. Congress had a chance to weigh in. It's not subject to review. But we could see a strong push to review. Now, I don't think that a review would be successful. I think the United States the Biden administration has enough support in the House and the Senate to ensure that it has a veto-proof majority over any efforts to block the deal. But certainly political rhetoric, an attempt by US Congress to block restoration of the JCPOA, all of that is going to add to the uncertainty about the sustainability of the deal. And I think, could make a much more, unstable footing for restoration of the deal to get off on. That translates into companies being concerned about going back into business with Iran. So that translates to less sanctions relief. And if Iran feels like it's not getting sanctions relief, it may then violate the deal. So I don't think, again, that that Congress could block restoration of the JCPOA, but I think there certainly could be ripple effects from any efforts to do so that could undermine the deal down the road.
So there's one more question that's shown up, and I will call this the last question given the hour. The question is, given the fact that the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the JCPOA, walked away from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, from the Open Skies Treaty, among others, what does this portend in the long run? And I'll anticipate that you might be uncomfortable with a real broad-ranging question about all multilateral treaties. So if you want to try to if you wish to confine your answer on that to arms control multilaterals, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think that it's important to, like I said, to put this in context and, to recognize that it wasn't just the US walking away from the JCPOA, as was referenced in the question, INF, Open Skies. All of this has dealt a serious blow to US credibility. And I think it risks sending a message to other countries that the United States cannot be counted on in a political agreement, cannot be counted on to meet its obligations. And all of that disincentivizes negotiations down the road. I mean, the North Koreans, for instance, were watching the JCPOA example, very closely. And I think it played into their strategy of wanting more concrete concessions from the United States up front, out of concern that, that negotiations, or a deal might break down because the US withdraws from it. So I'm very concerned, in the long term, that US nonproliferation efforts, US arms control efforts, will suffer because of that concern that the US is no longer a credible partner. And I think that that's some long-lasting damage that the Trump administration did to the international order, not just in the nuclear space, and that the ripple effects from this could have a serious impact on the U.S.'s ability to negotiate down the road. Not just with Iran and Russia, but like I said, also with North Korea and other potential proliferators. So I think the credibility blow, the fact that the United States walked away from the nuclear deal, despite our close European allies, urging the United States not to, all of that sends the wrong message. I mean, the allied question, I think, is particularly concerning. If close US allies do not view the United States as a credible partner that's concerned and responsive to their security interests, that has ramifications for US security partnerships down the road. So the credibility of the United States in future negotiations, the confidence that our allies have in the United States as a partner, I think all of those are some of the ramifications that the US is facing now because of how these agreements and treaties were treated by the Trump administration.
All right, we are just about out of time. I want to thank Kelsey Davenport for once again giving a great presentation, as you've done every time I've watched you. We really appreciate the information and the keen insights from your presentation. I want to also thank the participants for asking really great questions. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time to spend an evening with us here at the World Affairs Council. As I mentioned, this is the last presentation of our summer program. I'm afraid we don't yet know when the next presentation will be, and we don't yet know what the format of our 2021-22 season will be in. The pandemic is just evolving too quickly. It's just a little too dynamic. For those of you who are members of the World Affairs Council, you will get emails from the World Affairs Council as soon as we have clear information to send you. For everybody, I encourage you to go to the World Affairs Council website, because we'll also post updates there. You can see what's coming. And for anybody who might want to join the World Affairs Council, there's information for that there as well. So for everybody, thank you for spending an evening with us, and we'll see you all again soon.